genealogist with the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I don't know if you've heard of our department, but we research the Dawes enrollment to assist people in connecting back to it, to ancestors that had enrolled if they have the hopes of joining the tribe today. So I don't know how many of you guys are already familiar with the Dawes enrollment, but it was the original enrollment of the 5 what's called civilized tribes. It's going to be Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Muscogee, Creek, and the Seminole Nations. So I do have some talking points here, so forgive me if I am kind of back and forth. But I'm going to walk you through the history of the enrollment, kind of show you a breakdown of how it happened, why it happened, and why we still go back to these records today. I also talk fast, I'm going to do my best to slow down. So one of the most common questions that we get, what are the Dawes Rolls? So these were created as a federal effort to divide up the tribal lands that had originally been given to the tribes. So each application was put on what was called a census card. Now this went by a family group, so a head of household would be the first person on it, etc. That's one census card. Each person received a roll number if they received the land allotment. Those who were approved were added to added to the final Dawes Rolls, and today these records are extremely important when it comes to protecting our sovereignty and verifying eligibility for tribal membership or citizenship today. Okay, so as I just briefly covered, who is listed on the Dawes Rolls? There are 5 tribes: the Choctaw, or Mississippi Choctaw as well, Cherokee, Seminole, the Muscogee or Creek, and the Chickasaw Nations. So each person had to go through the enrollment process, but the point is to get approved, you had to link back somehow to one of these 5 tribes. So where does this term come from, the 5 civilized tribes? There are a lot of speakers who don't like to call it that, they just call it 5 tribes, because as we know now, there were many tribes that were civilized. The reason these tribes actually grew to have this nickname was because they adopted many of the lifestyles that the Americans had. This included education-wise, starting to have their own written language, all the way down to the way they practice their agriculture. So this comes along with, let's see, I can stop the wrong button. This is what made them be viewed as civilized. So of course today, like I mentioned, we do see that many tribes are civilized. Anyway. So next slide, this is briefly just going to go over what life was for Choctaws prior to the interference from the outside world. We were highly skilled in agriculture, growing corn, beans, squash, and many more things. Our life was settled and community focused. We were non-nomadic. Once we had the European settlers hit the eastern border, westward expansion just kind of caught fire and pushed over into the Mississippi homelands. So this was the beginning, basically, of the end of what life in the Americas was like before our tribe, which we'll keep coming back to, of course. So this timeline is going to help understand the key events. There were many events that actually led to the buildup of the enrollment, but these are just some of the bigger ones that created the Dawes Act and ultimately the final rules. So we're going to start in 1820. So we have the Treaty of Oak Stand. This is when the Choctaw Nation was pressured to give up land that was east of the Mississippi River, and in exchange for that, they were given land already in Oklahoma. It wasn't as much, obviously, but it wasn't a fair trade, but it was a trade. They basically, meaning government, had told our tribe that if we will secede that land, they'll leave us alone west of the Mississippi from treaty forced Choctaw and actually many other tribes to move to the west, which is what became known as Indian Territory. It was just a little square of land that went down to today's Oklahoma. So in 1851, we can see that the U.S. Congress began creating designated reservations in this territory. This didn't actually attribute to the Choctaw Nation. We didn't have reservations. This was mainly for the westward tribes that had started being moved in after we had already been removed in the early 1830s. So these were often far from their traditional homelands, and they're much smaller than what had been promised. You're taking 50, if not more, during this little area of time, tribes, and kind of shoving them into one little area. So of course their land isn't going to be what they expected, unfortunately. So in 1893, the U.S. government created the Dawes Commission. They were who was tasked with negotiating with the tribes to begin the enrollment process. It was just for land allotment. That's what it was originally for. And this was leading up to them having individual land allotments, apart from what we have always known as tribal land, where we all took care of it and all lived off of it. So in 1898, the Curtis Act comes into play. The Atoka Agreement. So this agreement, when the Dawes Commission was first initially trying to get people to apply for these land allotments, Choctaw Nation actually wasn't included in that, nor were the other 4 tribes. What kind of pushed that hand was the Atoka Agreement. This was something that Chickasaw and Choctaw actually came forward and voted on. It actually had to be voted on twice. The first time it was denied, second time it was passed. And then that led us to be a part of the Curtis Act, which is then what implemented these final rules. We'll touch base on these. I apologize. So I wanted to cover a very specific part of the Dancing Rabbit Creek Treaty. Article 14 of this treaty is important because it gave the Choctaws the choice. We were the first tribe that had been removed. It wasn't a fair choice. But nonetheless, the Choctaw people who didn't want to leave Mississippi during this removal, they were given an option to stay, and they could remove with their tribe later, but they were only given 6 months to decide this. If they stayed, they would be considered U.S. citizens, as they were told, and they would supposedly be granted their own land allotment. They would receive different kind of benefits, different funds, stuff like that. But they did, in return, have to give up their connection to their tribe. So later on, they couldn't come back and say they changed their mind, they wouldn't go back to their tribe, they wanted to be considered, back with their Choctaw roots. So sadly, most of these promises that were made to the Choctaws who stayed behind with this treaty were never fulfilled. Almost 1,600 stayed behind, and not even 200 received land or any kind of benefits. So over time, those that did remain, those that did not take them up on still taking this removal offer, they became known as the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. So although they're separate, this does give you a little bit insight of how we're connected to them. And they actually had to fight for decades for their own recognition. So this map shows Indian Territory. This is about 1892. This is a few years before the Dawes Rolls took place, so you can kind of see how it's broken up. One thing that actually surprises a lot of people is it wasn't a place for only natives. Yes, it's called Indian Territory, but with the expansion of the railroad and land runs, etc., it quickly became more populated with non-natives than it was natives. So by 1900, 2/3 of Indian Territory were actually non-natives. Okay, so this is where things start to kind of catch fire for the enrollment process. On February The idea behind this was to encourage the Native Americans to adopt private land ownership, just another form of the assimilation that we have seen in the past. So this was something that was very different from the way that most tribes had traditionally shared and cared for their land. So it made a lot of Native Americans kind of on edge about the decision. So to carry out the policy, the government formed the Dawes Commission March 3rd of 1893. It was made up of 3 men: Henry L. Dawes, who had introduced the General Allotment Act, aka the Dawes Act. He had also chaired the Committee on Indian Affairs. Then we have Archibald S. McKinnon. He's a federal judge. And we have Meredith Helm Kidd. He was a lawyer and a former state legislator. So together, they were tasked to convince the tribe to give up their communal land given to them for individual land allotments. So to be clear, they weren't just there to oversee paperwork. Sometimes people think they're just there to make final decisions. That absolutely wasn't it. Basically, the way Henry Dawes had worded it, the Native Americans needed as much help as they could get because they weren't selfish enough to take it themselves. So he was often praised in this time because of comments like this as the Indian's truest friend. So with this policy, it led to massive land loss, as we know today. Broken treaties, and it did lasting damage to many tribes' sovereignty. A lot of the phone calls we get are people that see their family show up on these rolls. These are the 1896 rolls. So in May of 1896, the Dawes Commission, they took a big step. Without the permission of the tribal government and still having some pushback, they decided to go ahead and start taking applications for those land allotments. A lot of the negotiations hadn't been finished through the government yet, so this caused mass confusion. There was a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of frustration. Tribal leaders were still trying to protect their sovereignty, but the U.S. government, they were quite literally just moving forward like everything was done. So some letters started pouring in from all over the country. People who had no cultural, legal connection to the tribes started writing in, asking how they could get on these rolls, how can they get their free Indian land. I don't know about you, but I don't feel like a lot of those people were legitimately connected to the tribes. So with this, it showed them how stressful this was going to be unless they had more boundaries, more requirements, some restrictions, some kind of path to follow. It does say a lot too that a lot of these applications they got on those 1896 rolls, this was purely for access to land. So on this side here, I love this picture. This is from the Dawes Commission camp that was set up in Ardmore, Oklahoma. I believe it's around 1900. So camps like this were how they started enrolling people. They would set up a camp if there was no other building available, and if it was a town, city, etc., they would use a city hall, a courthouse. But this kind of gives you a glimpse just how mobile, widespread it started becoming in Indian territory. And it makes it even look a little official, but you know. So the Etoka Agreement, I mean, we only briefly touched on it. This was an essential step toward implementing these 5 tribes to be a part of the Dawes enrollment. It laid out how the tribal lands would be divided among individual citizens, and that was a major shift from the communal withholding. So while freedmen and descendants were listed on these rolls, again, this was all application for land. So they were listed on there, they were included, they were assigned smaller allotments, intermarried whites, freedmen alike. But the big resources like your asphalt, a lot of timber, not oil, but it had been found oil, they were actually protected from the from being allotted to the tribes. I really hurt my accent now, I just now, I apologize. So this didn't stop the federal government from still trying to just allot out the rest of the land. With the Etoka agreement, they have stepped in, like I mentioned, they forced, at this point, the ones that had the most set up court system was going to be your Chickasaw and Choctaw tribes. They forced them to have a vote. Again, the first time it didn't pass. Congress stepped in, kind of forced them to do another vote, and then this time it passed. So this cleared the way for finalizing the rolls for allotting land, and it officially changed the structure of tribal land ownership. So this kind of segues us into the Curtis Act. At this point in the process, things were a mess. The 1896 rolls were full of problems, fraud, manipulation, and there was a lot of widespread resistance from the tribal government. I don't recall the exact number of times, but there were multiple times that Henry Dawes, McKinnon, or they had come forward to try to reach out to the tribe and say, hey, come meet us, let's make an agreement. And 4 or 5 times, just no one showed up. Nobody wanted this. So because of that, the original 1896 rolls, which had been started, again, without permission, they were just completely scrapped, completely voided out. So this is when Charles Curtis, a congressman from Kansas, he was actually a man of cause and dosage. He introduced a bill that would change all of this. So in 1896, he proposed to legislation to eliminate tribal government and to remove their authority to oversee citizenship or land matters. So the bill wasn't passed until 1898. You see the Etoka agreement in 1897, which kind of pushed us into that agreement. With that, it gave the federal government full control to start enforcing that Dawes enrollment. Fun fact though, Charles Curtis, he later went on to become the Vice President of the United States under President Hoover. This is 1929. He was the first Native American to actually hold that office. So once the enrollment began, like I mentioned, they would set up tents and whatnot. This is a photo from Dopesville, where they had set up having people come and apply. So many of them were built in tents, temporary structures. Like I mentioned, if they did have another building they could use in another town that was more settled, they utilized that. All the way down to where people didn't have access, they would take horses and wagons and go through swamps and all kinds of terrain to get to people who wanted to apply, because contrary to popular belief, they wanted people on these rolls, because the more people that got that land allotment, the more they knew for sure they were going to have people coming back after them, and they'd have whatever excess land they would have. So they needed to be, with the requirements, they needed to be living in Indian Territory before 1896, and they had to be alive and still residing in Indian Territory by September 25th of 1902. The state's important because that's the day they initially wanted to close the rolls and start processing the applications. So if someone claimed to be married, they were also required to provide legal proof of that marriage. It wasn't enough just to say you had a spouse. So if somebody had been married in, say, a traditional Choctaw marriage or a tribal marriage, it wasn't enough. Your spouse wouldn't be listed with you as your spouse. It would be on a separate card. Altogether, about 250,000 people applied to these roles, and only a little over 100,000, I think the exact number was about 101,000-ish, were actually accepted. And this is inclusive to all 5 tribes. That's not just Choctaw alone. So now let's look at specifically how the Choctaw applicants were categorized. I mentioned briefly about the card types that were available. So each census card created It was based on how solid the applicant's claim was. So you can find the classification on the line labeled field number at the top right hand of each card. That's usually just along where it says card number, it's just underneath it. There was the S cards, or the straight cards. Now, these are people who were just approved. They didn't have any doubts about their eligibility to become employees. The D cards, they stood for doubtful. These were cases where the commission wasn't sure of the applicant's lineage or their documentation stating that they were connected to the tribe. So they were basically just put on hold and set aside. The R cards were for the people who were rejected. These individuals were not approved for enrollment at all. Just in notation and passing, it's a whole other can of worms. Similar to today, they did have the right to appeal a decision of the court. So we do see some documents where sometimes the family did, but a lot of the times they did. So over time, the people on the doubtful cards, once their stuff was looked at more closely, if the evidence they provided was strong enough, then they would be moved to a straight card. And then, of course, if it wasn't strong enough, and they didn't have enough to confirm their lineage, they were moved to a rejected card. So now that we've gone over the cards and how they were categorized, we're going to start diving into the different types of enrollment that there was. So the first category that I'm covering is the Choctaw by blood. Applicants in this group were able to prove their direct lineage with a specific blood quantum. This could be anywhere from full blood to we see 1 3/4 listed on these rolls. But once the Curtis Act was passed in June of 1898, the Dawes Commission had full authority to start the process, and they did so starting with Choctaw by blood, at least for us, starting with these. So again, I did notate on there specifically September 25th, 1902. If they missed that date, they couldn't enroll. So it kind of shows you that maybe some of the people that weren't on those rolls, it's not that they weren't Choctaw. This was more so about meeting requirements that were given. So we have an actual Choctaw by blood census card here, and I just wanted to walk you through how to read it. So the first thing you'll notice, at the very top, you'll see the field number line that we covered. This family was accepted, so they have straight numbers, which means that they were approved for their land allotments. The second thing you'll see, it goes over the full name, age, sex, and blood quantum for each person that's listed on this card. The Dawes Commission documented their blood quantum at the time of application as part of the enrollment process. A lot of people didn't know what their blood quantum was because it wasn't anything we'd ever heard of. If you had blood, you had blood. In the bottom right corner of the card, you'll see the date the application was submitted. So these applications took years to process. You see that this family here, May 3rd of 1899 is when they applied. And then when you're looking at the left-hand side, you'll see the dates where they were approved. Some people on this card were accepted at different times. Maybe they needed more documentation, it took more investigation. But you see here them being accepted in 1904, which means they had been waiting 5 years for this application to be accepted. And finally, the most significant detail is going to be the roll number. So it wasn't just a form of ID or something that they were recognized by. This tied them to their land allotment. That's how those records were kept by this number. So every part of this card carries meaning. Learning how to read the details is essential for understanding the connection each person had to their tribe. So the next category is Choctaw by intermarriage. This was for people people who didn't have a blood bond themselves, but had married a Choctaw person. This was true for husbands and wives. However, it was a lot easier for a man who had married a Choctaw woman to get approved and put on these rolls, simply because the documents that were turned in appeared more formal, possibly a little bit of favoritism as well. That doesn't say that there are no wives listed on there, but it just was easier. So again, one good thing with the commission was they had to have a government issued or a state marriage license. Without this document, it could hinder their application being accepted for years. As we see, a lot of people apply, this was all done by hand, and a lot of the major decisions came down to 3 men. So if the legal documentation wasn't ever provided, then they would just be moved from a doubtful card to a rejected card. So sometimes it was just about not having the right documents to prove anything. It's also important to notate, intermarried Choctaws were considered citizens, and a lot of them actually played a lot of major roles in our government. I thought that was really cool too. They had the right to vote, participate in governmental roles. So this is the Choctaw intermarriage card, or an IW card, intermarried white card, people call it different things. But if you look at the actual card, you'll see how it's not different from the Choctaw white blood. The first thing you'll notice is the blood bond column. You'll see that the head of household, Fritz Sattel, he is listed as IW. He doesn't have a blood bond listed, he's listed as an intermarried white. So this tells us that he wasn't enrolled based on tribal ancestry. He was enrolled because he was married to a Choctaw citizen or Choctaw woman. So next, let's look at the roll numbers. You'll see that that's different as well. Fritz next to his has an IW in front of his roll number. So the prefix lets us know again, his status wasn't based off of blood, it was based off of his marriage. And then if you look at the section where he lists his parents, they're both listed as non-citizens. So this confirms again that Fritz himself was not Choctaw by blood. This is purely just marrying into the tribe. A lot of these notations are in these cards, inside their application packets. It took a lot to turn in to get on these rolls as an intermarried wife. So the details, such as the IW, the roll number prefix, even the status of his parents, this helps show how the intermarried applicants were tracked during this progress. It does also show how important the documentation was to get put on the rolls at all. So newborn Choctaw by blood, after the main Dawes enrollment period ended, I know I said September 25th, 1902, that was the day they originally wanted them to close. September 25th, 1902 comes around, and they still had people coming to them saying, hey, since my application's been turned in, we've had children. I need to get them enrolled. And they had such a vast amount of people that they said, okay, we're going to extend it a little longer, and we'll start taking enrollment for these children. So this kicked off the newborn Choctaw by blood. So one of the key requirements for these enrollees was that their parent had to have already been accepted by September 25th of 1902, or had their application turned in by this date. They had to themselves apply. So basically, this category was just an extension. This specific group only includes those born during that narrow window after the rolls had been certified. So this is a newborn Choctaw by blood. You'll notice it's a lot different than the Choctaw by blood cards and the, same card, Choctaw by blood with an intermarried on that. just this one created for these children. And then next, you can look at how the parents are listed. You'll see that both the parents are included on the card along with their own enrollment information. I think even so it has their names, roll numbers, etc. And then it even lists a birthday. We don't see that on the other cards. Only these newborn cards and what we'll cover next, the minor cards, list an actual birthday on it. So as you can tell, this child's 4 years old. You'll see that this isn't a newborn. So it doesn't mean just because they're on a newborn card that they are newborn. Just like with the minor cards that we'll look at, there's infants on them. This was just part of the process. We already know it was a mess. It's just kind of the mess that they were handling with. So finally, if you look down at the remarks section, I always thought this was funny. You probably saw the other cards. They just scribbled all over these cards. I guess they finally got tired of that because they now have a remarks section specifically for any kind of comments, information, and clarifications. These cards are a lot easier to read for us than those other ones. So after newborns, the commission added the minor Choctaw white blood category. This process started on March 5th, 1905, the same day that the newborn one had ended, and this lasted to March 4th, 1906. It was designed to give enrollment to children who were eligible but haven't yet been included on the newborn rolls. They could have been minors at the time, obviously, or their parents' applications hadn't been processed, or were still pending, something along those lines. So to be included, they had to be under 18, and they had to have at least one Choctaw white blood parent. It's basically a catch-up category. So what's funny about these cards is, if it looks familiar, it's because it's the newborn. They just kind of blotted out the word newborns and stamped minor at the top. You'll notice that the layout is, of course, the exact same roll number format, same fields for the birthday, parent information, etc. It's hard to see on this card, but on the portion where the roll number is, it's an M for minor on these. So if you see a roll number pop up during any kind of family research, we know I'm W, intermarried white, NB newborn, N severe minors. So this next category goes over the Choctaw Freedmen cards. The Dawes Commission created a separate role for individuals who had lived in the Choctaw Nation and came to Indian Territory with the tribe. Many Choctaw Freedmen lived in the nation, spoke the language, practiced the culture, ate food, had the same heritage and cultural practices, and they participated in everyday Choctaw life. So while they were included in the Dawes enrollment process, they were documented separately. This is a reflection in the way their cards and their roll numbers were documented. So we'll see that they look a little different. This is an example of a Choctaw Freedmen census card. One of the first things you're going to notice, I'll get a close-up of it, but there's not a blip on that's listed on these cards. So the front side is what was used for the applicants. The reverse side was for more family details. For now, just keep in mind, this layout is different. This is the first side, front side. So first you'll notice the standard information that's listed, age, sex, and sometimes a reference to prior enrollment to 1896 rolls. It does list slave of, it lists the Choctaw person. While the rolls were eventually voided, any previous application records were actually used for their application in 1898. So for example, somebody comes to apply in 1898, the commission decides to go back and look on these older records, and they say, well, here, I see that you were living here, did already try to apply, that's going to help your case. confirmed that they were eligible for a land allotment. So while we don't interpret the language listed on here, slave of today, you'll see how it was often used in this enrollment category. It reflects how the Dawes Commission approached documentation at the time for the freedmen. We'll see on the reverse side. First thing you see is a little note here. Probably, I don't know if you can see it very well on the screen. It says printed numbers in the first column refer to individual names on the reverse side. So the reverse side, we have Mary Brown, I think, as the head of household. This reverse side is going to say number 1, who was her father, so on and so forth. It's just kind of a flip-flop back and forth. So it's important because it shows how the card is meant to be read. Like I covered before hitting that, it goes by the number in front of it, by each person on the front to the back. Let's see. This is how they were able to keep ties in family when it came down to the freedmen applicants in what was called family units. So now we're looking at a very unique enrollment category. This is the Mississippi Choctaw. The Mississippi Choctaw, these were the citizens who chose not to relocate during the frontiers. They resided or stayed in more common homelands like Alabama, Louisiana, and obviously a majority in Mississippi. So starting in December of 1902, the Dawes Commission had open interviews and applications for the Mississippi Choctaw. They had people going up there saying, hey, this is what they're doing down there. We're giving you an opportunity to be a part of it. So we see a lot of the Mississippi Choctaw applications at our census cards. It lists them in Alabama, Louisiana, sometimes Texas, and Mississippi. So since there were fewer records to verify their ancestry compared to all the ones that were already in Indian territory, the commissioners often conducted these intensive cross-examinations for the Mississippi Choctaw, which we'll cover as well. In total, about 2,597 individuals applied as Mississippi Choctaw. Of those, only 1,457 received approval with roll numbers and were granted their land allotments. This is a complex group. There was some type of loophole. It hasn't been easy to confirm which one, but there was a loophole to where people could come and say, I'm Mississippi Choctaw, but I don't have documentation because I wasn't here. So we saw a lot of fraud with these Mississippi Choctaw applications, just kind of right under the nose of the Dawes Commission. But these are the people who never left their ancestral homelands, but wanted their recognition now. So many of the interviews began in Mississippi. Where the applicants were still living, of course. The early interviews were documented on what's called an initial field card. It looks like the Choctaw white blood card, but this was just their initial application. They had, I guess you could call it a two-parter. If an applicant had turned in their application in Mississippi, they were considered identified. Then they had to complete the process by removing or relocating to Indian Territory, taking their paperwork to the commission there, and proving that they had relocated. So this was a key condition. They had to be present in Indian Territory to be fully accepted. So when we conduct a lot of the research today, it's the information on the final part. So as you can see down below, if they had relocated, they would transfer their information to this new card. This is essentially creating a completely second card for recognition. But that's where they're issued their roll numbers. I should have had a better photo now that I'm thinking about it. There is notation on those cards. It tells the date of their relocation, and then it also tells the date of when they came and turned in that documentation, proving that they have relocated. That one. So this is an example of the Mississippi Choctaw rejected application. And I want to point out something that is very often confused people when we have them reach out. So if you've ever heard of someone mention an MCR number, sometimes people reach out saying that they have found their family on the rolls. They'll start out, and we immediately know that it's a rejected card because they say their card number is MCR XXX. But this is Mississippi Choctaw rejected. These were the individuals who had applied that were living outside of Indian Territory. Like I had mentioned, they did have to prove their removal for that second part of it. If they never relocated, even after being identified, they were rejected. They were Choctaw and did not follow the requirements. They would be rejected. Their descendants would not be eligible for membership today, the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. So this is the only part for that, of course, because since they never followed the rest of the requirements, they were never transferred to another card. So this would be the only card we see. A lot of Mississippi Choctaw applications, from my personal experience sorting through them, they do come off maybe fraudulent. And I only say that because they kind of right off the bat, looking through some of the documentation, they have no knowledge of Choctaw history, Choctaw treaties, Choctaw language, they're not able to understand it, speak it, anything like that. So that's kind of a telltale sign when it came down to the Dawes Commission looking at those. Those are some of the things they look for among physical traits as well. Also, if you zoom in here, you'll see where they're classified. They have the R in front of that field number, another telltale sign saying that they are rejected. Cross-examinations. This is one of my favorite parts of researching the roles. This was a formal interview that was conducted between the commission and the applicant. Not the applicant, witnesses that the applicant had brought in. These were not for everyone. They were mainly used for those whose applications were marked doubtful, which we saw a lot on the Mississippi Choctaw cards. So in these cases, the commission felt like they lacked enough evidence, and they invited the applicants back for follow-up questions and information to give. During the cross-examination, applicants could bring witnesses, documents, or any other proof to validate their claim of Choctaw citizenship. Cross-examinations were really a second opportunity intended only for borderline cases. So this was aimed to ensure that the deserving applications had a final chance to prove their eligibility. If you haven't done research on these, I highly suggest you do. Really fun to read through, basically verbatim. So it's like watching history in real time. So this is an example of cross-examination with Horace Festucci. He's listed on Census Card 2040. His interview is dated as May 4th of 1901. These cross-examinations, they played a significant role in that final decision. So this was what helped someone between being accepted or denied. So they would ask them detailed questions about their ancestry, resident and family connections. If we zoom in here for Horace's card, you'll see it says Horace Festucci, having been first duly sworn upon his oath, testifies as follows through Tom Tuppy, the official interpreter. Horace could not speak English; he only spoke Choctaw. So that small detail, it really did give some insight into some of these Mississippi Choctaw interviews. So many of those Mississippi Choctaw applicants were still speaking Choctaw language. So it highlights how strong that they held on to their cultural and linguistic traditions, even decades after this removal. So in addition to helping the commission gather facts, these cross-examinations also give us the valuable insight insight into the daily lives and identifications of the people who had to go through this process. So like I mentioned, when we were looking at that Mississippi Choctaw rejected card, not every application was accepted to the Dawes Commission. There were a range of reasons why. It's not just one whole thing. Some families simply didn't enroll in time. They may have missed their deadlines, been unaware of the process, which we don't see often. If they had to come in and try to do their application later, this again was pretty widespread. Not saying that nobody out there won't do that. So it's important to know that most of the rejected applications that they were fraudulent. They were not Choctaw. So in Mississippi, the Dawes Commission received an overwhelming number of false claims by non-Choctaw people. They had lied, tried to receive land, many of them caught in their lies. You can sometimes see it in cross-examination. Like I had mentioned, they didn't have any knowledge of it, but with that loophole of them not having to have documentation, a lot of people fought it. So you see a lot of these MCR cases, core documentation. So others though, they could have just struggled to get documentation. Some didn't know their family lineage, some had gone to live with other family or neighbors because their parents died when they were really young. Again, this was a complicated process. Sometimes, like I mentioned, it was based on physical appearance, their ability to speak and understand Choctaw language, and then just what they already knew when it came down to their family, and then of course the enrollment that's on the 1896 rules. So once an applicant had been approved, added to the rolls, they were entitled to a land allotment. Each Choctaw by blood was allotted either 160 acres of homestead, or they would get 320 acres of surplus, or grazing land. So the difference between, or farmland, the difference was depending on the land's agricultural value. The better the quality of land, the less the enrollers received. If someone was a single enrollee with no dependents, they received a smaller amount, typically about 80 acres. Not all the land that was claimed was distributed. Lands with more resources were set aside for sale, and the sale of those lands went to the Choctaw people. Not all of those sales, but a lot of the money did get turned back into the tribe. So by the time the surplus land had started being sold in about 1910, there was still about 1.7 million acres left. That land was then opened up for purchase, primarily to non-native settlers. So by 1932, just 45 years after the General Allotment Act was passed, non-native settlers had acquired 2/3 of all native held land, which is over 92 million acres out of the original 138 million that they held. So the shift shows how quickly land ownership had changed under allotment, and it helps explain why these records matter so much today. So to the right, you'll see an original promotional flyer they had out. This was the advertisement for upcoming sale of Indian land. So across the top, we can see it says Indian land for sale. Phrases like get a home of your own, easy payments, perfect title, all language that was designed to appeal to settlers that were looking for opportunity and hold them into Indian territory. I don't know if you can see closely, but it does give a breakdown of the type of land that was being offered: irrigated grazing, agricultural, dry farming. So this wasn't just about settling land, it was about marketing it. So this picture reflects how quickly the surplus land was originally intended for Native citizens. It became a part of a broader expansion effort. So although the official enrollment period ended in 1906, there was one final stop processing them, even if they have been turned in on time. So by the time they had won their court case, the land had already been allotted. There was no more land left. So they were given money instead. And unfortunately, much of that money went right to the lawyers who they had hired to defend them to get listed on these rolls. So these additions are still considered part of the final Dawes roll. We do recognize them in genealogical research today, and being added, their descendants are eligible for membership today. So pull up this card a little bit. So if you zoom in this card, you'll see how unusual these additions were. Obviously unexpected. Perhaps they didn't expect them to win the case. But you'll notice this is actually a newborn Choctaw by blood card. Basically all we did was cross out newborn, and they added, instead of where it says the act of Congress agreed upon or approved upon, they scribbled out the April portion and just stamped that August 1st, 1914. So this kind of improvising on an official document. It shows in many ways that there were still attempts to include those that had been left out. And although the additions were way later, they're still very much official. So the Choctaw Nation's modern constitution, it was adopted in 1983. This is after the federal government restored the nation's right to self-govern, which had been taken away from us with the Curtis Act. This document outlines how the government operates, who qualifies as a member, and Article 2 is especially important because it defines tribal membership for us. So to be a member, a person must be directly descended from someone listed as Choctaw by blood on the Choctaw rolls, or on the Dawes rolls. Said Choctaw a lot today, sorry. So everything we've talked about, from the agreement to Dawes Rolls to the 1983 Constitution, this shows how the federal policies have drastically changed over time and how they have affected the Choctaw Nation people today. The Dawes Rolls, they were originally used to divide and control tribal lands, but today they play a completely different role. They're the legal foundation for our membership today and for many other tribes. I believe all 5 of the tribes actually revert back to these roles. So this history does still affect real people. Mississippi Choctaw, who did not move here, now their descendants live here, for example. People that were denied when they shouldn't have been. It does protect our sovereignty, but understanding where it came from, it really helps us better understand where we are now and why. So today, the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma has more than 210,000 enrolled members. While many still live in the boundaries of our nation, others are spread across the country and the world. I have talked to Choctaw members that live in New Zealand and Hawaii, and then you have people just right there down the road. No matter where people live, they're a part of this story. As we continue to grow, so is the importance of preserving and sharing these records